All right, in the next couple lectures, I want to talk about this issue of punishment. Punishment, criminal punishment to be more specific, is an interesting issue and an important one. And that's one reason to talk about it. I also want to talk about it because I think looking at how Kantianism and utilitarianism approach this issue will allow us to better understand both theories. It'll especially allow us to get a better understanding of this important and I would even say inspiring Kantian concept of always treating people as ends in themselves. An important, if you're me, maybe even inspiring concept, but also one that's maybe a little hard to figure out exactly what it means, right? And I think looking at what Kantians say about punishment will help us with that. And it'll help us avoid some misconceptions about what it is to treat someone as an end in themselves, to respect them as a rational being. Okay, so to start with, let's talk about the utilitarian perspective on punishment. And as Rachel's points out, for a utilitarian, punishing criminals is an evil. It's an evil in the sense that it has costs and happiness. Why is that? Well, pretty much by definition, punishment causes someone pain, right? If something we do to somebody is not something they dislike, is not something that causes them physical, emotional pain, then it's not a punishment, right? We used to have this cat, I think I've talked about him before, Mr. Whiskers, and, sometimes he would scratch my roommate Brian, and when he would scratch Brian, Brian would get mad at him and put him in the basement, right? That was his punishment. I mean, A, I don't know that the cat was smart enough to put this together. Cats are not smart animals. But B, Brian didn't spend a lot of time at the house. He's usually with his girlfriend. If he had known that Mr. Whiskers desperately wanted to get into the basement, right? Being in the basement made Mr. Whiskers happy. I don't know why. So, being put in the basement was not a punishment for Mr. Whiskers because the cat loved that, right? Anyway, so if you love it, it's not a punishment. It has to be something you dislike, or it's not a punishment. So punishment, by definition, by its very nature, causes pain. Again, you remember utilitarians count mental pain as well as physical. Usually the kinds of punishments we impose, more mental pain than physical, but pain of some sort, right? And imposing punishment uses resources, especially the sorts of punishment we favor in our society, right? Our favorite form of punishment, at least for crimes that are more severe, is to put people in jail or prison, right? Well, it costs money to put somebody in jail or prison, right? The amount varies wildly, but I looked it up this morning. It ranges from $14,000 a year to $70,000 a year, depending on the state. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money that could be spent elsewhere to create happiness, right? Punishment makes people unhappy, and it uses resources. Well, why in the world do we even do it, right? Well, because punishment might have payoffs that make the costs of punishment worth it. Well, what are those payoffs? Well, one payoff is that people just tend to like seeing criminals punished, right? Most people like to see criminals punished, and they're unhappy if criminals aren't punished. That's one payoff of punishing criminals. The biggest payoff, the biggest reason to punish criminals, the thing that makes it on the whole worth it for utilitarians, when it is worth it, is crime prevention. We pay this cost because it's worth it given the crimes we prevent and the unhappiness they would cause. All right. So how does punishing criminals prevent crime? Well, one thing is the criminal himself is hampered from committing crimes when he's incarcerated. Now, I mean, look, it doesn't entirely prevent him from committing crimes. He can still commit crimes in jail, but, his opportunity to commit crimes is limited, and the people he can commit crimes against also very limited. But bigger than that is deterrence. People who want to commit crimes know that we have punishments for those crimes, and they see other people being punished, and they think, well, I want to commit this crime, I want to beat this guy up, or I want to sell drugs, or I want to do whatever, I want to steal something. Well, is it worth it? And because punishments are in place and they see people being punished, for most cases, it's not worth it to them to commit the crime. So, punishment prevents a lot of crimes. That's what makes it worth it when it is for the utilitarian. Well, so here's a question, right? Why don't we punish children and the insane for crimes, right? We don't punish the insane, we just force them to get care, right? Children, it's a complicated issue, but we either don't punish children for crimes or we punish them much more lightly, right? Well, the utilitarian would say, because this deterrence doesn't work on children or the insane, right? If you're insane and you either can't control your actions or you can't really think about the consequences of them rationally, punishment won't deter you in the way it deters others, so we don't threaten you with punishment, we just make you get care until you're no longer a threat. Children, kind of a gray zone because they do have some control over their actions, especially given older ages, but they're not entirely rational. Deterrence isn't all that effective when it comes to kids, right? Kids infamously have poor impulse control, especially younger children. Well, then another question we might ask is, why do we punish some crimes more heavily than others, right? Because we definitely do that, right? If you're caught shoplifting, you will get a lighter sentence than if you steal a car, right? And, if you kill somebody, in most circumstances, there's different kinds of killing, manslaughter, murder, whatever. But in most circumstances, if you kill somebody in a criminally liable way, you will go to jail for much longer than you will if you steal a car, even longer than you would if you shoplifted, right? And we think that's appropriate, right? We should not send shoplifters to jail for the amount of time we send car thieves, and we should not send either to jail for the amount of time we send murderers. Well, why do that? Well, a utilitarian will say more punishment equals more deterrence. There's a lot of people who won't commit a crime that they're thinking of committing just because there's a punishment, right? 6 months in jail, if somebody wants to beat somebody up, 6 months in jail would deter a lot of people from doing that. But there's some people that wouldn't, right? Either they have poor impulse control or they think, well, beating the stuffing out of this guy's worth it. Well, but some of those people that wouldn't be deterred by 6 months will be deterred by a year. Some of those people who wouldn't be deterred by a year in jail will be deterred by 5 years. More punishment, more deterrence. Ideally, the more heavily you punish a crime, the fewer people will do it. But whether the extra deterrence of more punishment is worth it depends on a crime. Given the incredible costs and happiness that murder imposes on society, more deterrence is almost always worth it, up to you get to a lot of punishment. Shoplifting, no, right? You will very quickly run into a point where more deterrence simply isn't worth it. The unhappiness that more jail time or more punishment causes the criminal, plus the use and resources, simply aren't worth it. This is especially so because you run into a phenomenon called diminishing marginal returns. After a certain point, and you see this in a lot of areas, after a certain point, each additional bit of X gets you less of Y. Let me give you guys an example, right? If you're buying a house, the difference between the house you can buy for $150,000 and the house you can buy for $250,000 is huge. You cannot, in this market around here, in most places, get a decent house for $150,000. You can get a pretty decent house, or at least you could before, the housing market went crazy, for $250,000. Huge gap between $150,000 house and a $250,000. Also a big gap between the $250,000 and $350,000, right? You go from pretty decent house to maybe even in some places actually kind of nice. Well, between the $350,000 house and the $450,000 house, still a gap, but not as big, right? But think about this. What's the difference between a $10 million home and a $10 million, $100,000 home, right? Probably not very much. Maybe like one more bathroom or something, or, one has 10 bathrooms, one has 11. If you have that many bathrooms, one bathroom is not going to make a difference, right? Once you get to a certain amount, an additional $100,000 makes very little difference. If you ever start a program of exercise, I've done this a lot, those things about being middle-aged, the first 5 pounds you lose are actually pretty easy. The next are much harder. You have to exercise and diet a lot more. The next 5 harder still, right? Diminishing marginal returns pops up in a lot of places. Well, it pops up with punishment because with punishment, you rapidly get to a point where each additional bit of punishment gets you less and less deterrence. Most people who will not be deterred by 5 years for assault will not be deterred by 6. It's a rare person who thinks, oh, it's worth it at the possibility of 5, it's not worth it at 6, right? On the other hand, a lot of people who might beat the stuffing out of somebody they don't like will not do it with the threat of a year in prison, right? I'll not say anything, but right, a year will deter a lot of people who might go and beat up somebody they don't like if there was no punishment at all. Well, now, given this, I think a utilitarian would say we probably need lighter punishments for many crimes than we have. We probably punish people too harshly in our society in that we pay too much. A good example of this is probably drug dealing, right? The main way that drug laws deter drug use is they make drugs more expensive. But it turns out that simply making drugs illegal and having any kind of punishment for dealing drugs drives up the price of drugs a lot. But more punishment for dealing drugs will drive up the price of drugs a little bit, but not much. There's a famous study in the 80s. We came down really, 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 really hard on cocaine. Especially crack cocaine, which, I won't rehash it, but there's almost certainly a racial component to that, right? Not get into that, but the bigger issue is none of these harsher punishments for cocaine seem to deter cocaine selling or cocaine use very much. We tacked on years and years in jail. And the reason for this is because it didn't do very much to drive up the cost of cocaine. All this hardcore 80s era war on drugs probably drove up the price of cocaine about 10%, they think. That's not going to get you a lot of deterrence, right? Think about this, right? If the price of something you like, let's say soda, went up 10%, would you stop buying it? Probably not. Would you buy less of it? Also probably not, right? So, with drug laws, we are by most scientific studies, we are well past a point of diminishing marginal returns, probably paying too much. We could probably, you know, lighten these sentences, get the deterrence we want, and pay less in the way of unhappiness, both to the people we punish and for incarcerating these people, right? There's probably a lot of other good examples with crimes. I'll let you guys think about that. But, utilitarian will always insist, are we paying too much? And if we are, we should lighten the sentence, lighten the punishment.